Okay, that's doing it. Good. All right. So, thanks everyone. My name is Adam. I am one of the careers consultants as part of the careers team. And in this session, we're going to be looking at interviews, which is one of those things that I don't know, I might be a bit biased, but I always ask students what is the part of the process that you struggle with the most. Interviews is the one that doesn't come up as often as I maybe expect, in the sense that people think that they need work on their CV, they need work on their applications. But interviews, I'm fine with interviews. I'm fairly personable. I usually find that it's the other way around. If you think to yourself, can you give a good interview? I find that most people think that they can. I have been on quite a few interview panels for my sins, and good interviews are very rare. So it is something that I think people find challenging, but it's also the part of the whole process. You don't think at least you can control as much. So there's a tendency not to think about the interview and to think about the other parts of the process, the application, the assessment center. What we're going to do in this session, it's going to take about 45 minutes, is we're going to look at the things that you actually can control in an interview and how to come across really well. Now, like I said at the top, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat and I'll get to those as we go through. If you could, please just take a minute to scan that QR code for me. I'll give you a second to do that. What this does is register your attendance at this event, which means that I can then send you the slides and send you the recording of the session. It makes it much easier for us to do that. So it guarantees that you'll get these and then you won't need to take notes. You'll have the recording as and when you need it. I'll just give you a second to do that. Okay. All right, I will show this up at the end. So in case, I don't know, you don't have your phone to hand or you're on your phone and it's a bit challenging at the moment, I'll put this up at the end just in case we catch any latecomers and all that sort of thing. So in terms of what we're going to cover, I'm going to go sort of step by step. We're going to look at the online resources. So let's say you've got an interview, an invite, and you think, right, where do I start? We're going to take it literally step by step. So the first thing, you'd look at online resources. I'll tackle the difference between a live and a recorded online interview. Then the whole process, what to do beforehand. We're going to take a brief pause for any questions, what to do during the interview, and then what to do after your interview. And a little bit of Q&A, so if you've got any questions, we'll pause at the end. All right, so let's put yourself in that position. You've got an invite to an interview. What do you do first? Well, there's our website is the first port of call, okay? This is where everything that we know about interviews, how to do them, the types of interview, all that information is on here. This is our website that you can see on the screen. On the right, you also have a video playlist, a version of this talk, which is a bit more bite-sized, about how to tackle interviews. So if you just want a refresher or, you flame out of this session because your internet crashes or whatever, this is where to go. Like I said, everything that we know about interviews, what to expect, all that information is on there. So even if it's just to give you a refresher, have a look at some of these pages. And those are your online resources. There are lots of other resources. On the right-hand side, you'll see we link out to things like Glassdoor, Prospects. These can be really helpful as well. So this is your one-stop shop for basically all the online resources around interviews that we are aware of. Which brings me to interviews themselves. So I'm going to pause for a second. What do you think is the worst thing about an interview? Put your answers in the chat for me. Now, this could be anything, right? It could be the pressure. It could be having to talk about yourself. What do you think, for you, is the thing that you least look forward to about an interview? Why do you think we should hire you as a question? Fair, unexpected questions. All right, we'll definitely tackle that. A few different things. Yeah, okay. Not really sure what that means, but fine. But being asked questions that you don't have the answer to, 100%. Forgetting the content, so that sort of split second of my mind's gone blank. What do I do? All completely valid, right? Getting stuck, can you ask to come back to something? That balance of being confident versus coming across as humble and being too arrogant and all that sort of thing. Absolutely, all of this stuff is what we've written down as well as us. So that kind of why did you apply to us? Why are you here? If it's the video interview, things like the countdown timer, that can put a lot of people off. Some people, the technology, what happens if everything goes wrong, remembering everything. So there's all sorts of things that, throw a spanner in the works, let's say. And these are the things where you might think, oh, I really, yeah, I know I have to do this, but it's challenging, right? Now, the biggest piece of advice I would give, because a lot of these come from nerves, I'll be honest. And it is very easy, I will probably say this a few times, but it's very easy to think that you have no power in these situations. For obvious reasons, right? You feel like you're on show, you're trying to convince someone that you're a good fit for the job, that you'd be a good fit for the organization. But please sort of reframe this in your mind. You do have some power in this process. It's very much a two-way street. Yes, there's an element of you trying to convince them that you'd be a good fit, but there's also that idea of, do I want to work here? Do I want to work with these people? I know it's an easy thing for me to say and a harder thing to do, but there is an element of fact finding in interviews. What do you need to know about an organization, or what do you need to see? What do you need to experience about a company to know that you want to work there? Go with that kind of mindset. Try and train yourself into that kind of mindset. And genuinely, it can take some of the nerves out, and it makes things like figuring out what it is you want to ask them or the kind of things that you want to see. It makes it easier. And like I said, puts a little bit of pressure off you. Now, there are lots of different types of interview, and I'm going to cover how to deal with all of them. They all pretty much operate in the same way, but here are your main five, the things that you could come up against. We'll start at the top with your video interview, and then on the bottom left, you'll see telephone slash Skype slash Teams slash Zoom, whatever that is. Those are two different things. Just be aware of that. So when we say video interview, what we mean there is that you will log into some kind of online platform or portal, usually that the company operates, and then questions will come up on the screen in text form, and you'll have to record a video response to that. That is what we mean when we say video interview. Whereas Skype, Zoom, that's something different. That is just either an informal chat or a panel interview, those two on the right hand side, over that platform, over Zoom, over Teams. Okay. And then we've got your group interview, which is where they will just interview a group of people. Those last ones, they tend to be rarer for graduate roles. You see that at sort of high level, director level. So we don't really need to worry about that too much. But all of the others, these are the things that you could come up against. The reality is that the techniques that you use for a video interview are exactly the same as you would use for a panel, are exactly the same as you would use for a one-to-one. And the things I'm going to talk about are perfectly applicable to all of those. You just need to be aware that this is what you could come up against. So for example, the panel interview, just in case you're not aware of that, that is where you could turn it to an interview and there might be 2, 3, 4 people interviewing you and alternating between asking questions. That might be intimidating, and yeah, fair enough. I can understand why you'd feel that way. However, it's not really to catch you out. The reason that panel interviews are quite common is to get different people's perspectives and make sure it's as inclusive, but also as unbiased as possible. So none of this, I promise, is to catch you out. All it is to get a different level of perspective on different parts of the process. Okay. Now I've gone through those. So that's what you could come up against. So you need to think, again, imagine you've been put into that situation. You've got an interview coming up. What do you do? There are a few steps that I want you to try and keep in mind, and I don't skip any of these because they are quite important. First thing is the job itself and the organization. Okay. So there's a couple of things here. First, we want to research the company. And when I say that, I mean doing a little bit more than just looking at their website. That's your starting point. But do things like look at Glassdoor. Think about where they are in their market. Think about their competitors as well. How are they different from their competitors? Then I want you to look at the job description. That's really important. What a lot of people will do is they'll spend all their time on the company, they'll spend all their time on things like predicting what questions are going to come up, all of which is valid, but they won't look at the job description. And then one of the questions I like to ask is, what do you actually understand the job to be? Why are you here in another form, right? What do you think you're applying to? That can throw a few people. So make sure you're understanding what it is you're applying to. And then a couple of things, definitely make sure if it's a in-person interview, you know how to get there. Know what your route is so you're not turning up late, you're not rushing, you're not flustered. And if you can, use LinkedIn to find a little bit about your interviewers. So find those interviewers on LinkedIn. Quite often, you'll be told who's going to be interviewing you. So just do that little bit of prep work. And then think about this will all go into what questions do I want to ask these people. Okay. So that's what you need to do before you get there. Now, the good news is it's pretty easy to predict the majority of what's going to be asked. More often than not, it'll be why are you here? So, what your career aspirations are, why are you applying, and what do you know about that organization? I'll probably ask a little bit about your education, your work experience, skills, achievements. I mean, the big one really is what we refer to as competencies, competency-based questions, which is a fancy way of saying the ability to do certain things, right? And the way you predict that is the reality is you've been given a cheat sheet in the job description and the person specification. So this is a person specification that we use. So you'll see here, we've got the actual description of absolutely everything we're asking for from a candidate. So here you can see the experience we want, the skills we want, and on the right-hand side, here it says tested by, so A, application, I, interview, P would be presentation, T would be test. For this specific role, all it is application interview. If it says interview, you know that they are likely to ask about that specific skill or experience. So this is how you predict. Which leads me to a little bit of preparation that you should be doing. Whenever you apply to a job, whatever that job is, keep the relevant materials, keep the job description, keep the person specification, because that is how you will predict what they're asking you. That is what you will use when preparing for a job interview. Okay, this is quite important. Like I said, it's your cheat sheet. This is how you can predict basically everything they're going to ask. Right? Now, if it is an online interview, there's a couple of things I want you to do. And mainly, they're about checking the technology. So do a little bit of prep. Make sure your audio works. Make sure your microphone, your webcam, whatever you're using, make sure it is working. Okay? Make sure your internet connection, wherever you are going to do this interview, is good enough, and try and make sure that you're doing it in an appropriate place. So you're not doing it in a busy cafe. I know not everybody has the space at home to be able to do this, but think ahead. Where are you going to have this interview? Can you make sure that the camera angle's right? Can you make sure that your room's tidy if that's where you're doing it? You want to make sure that you have complete control first over the tech and over the space you're doing it in. For a couple of reasons. The more control you have over the space, the more comfortable you're going to be at a basic level. And the more control you have over the tech, the more you test it, the more you know it's working. If anything does happen, technology-wise, then you can be pretty sure that it's not you. That will give you a level of confidence. So make sure you do this. Doesn't need to be like a huge performance. You don't need to go into huge levels of what happens if this happens, what happens if that, what do I do? But you just need to make sure you can be seen, you can be understood, you can be heard. And obviously, things like making sure you're dressed correctly. Okay. You are going to have your camera on for an online interview. It's just the hard and fast rule. So you need to make sure you're coming across well. Already gone through some of this, talked about attire, but noise, lighting, background, and the advantage of an online interview, you can have information to hand. You can have your notes, so the notes that you took when preparing for the interview. You might want to have the website of the organization up or something like that. So use it to your advantage if you can. Okay. And the last thing before we move on to the body of the interview itself, get as much practice as possible. Now, obviously, you can do this with friends, you can do this with family. What I would suggest is that we have the capacity to offer you what we call interview simulations. These are mock interviews. You can have one per semester. So we always suggest maybe wait until you've got an actual interview invite. But this is where we will take you through an interview that is tailored towards what you're actually being interviewed for. So you'll send us a job description, we'll create an interview for you, we'll take you through the interview as though it was a real thing, and then give you feedback then and there. I can't stress how valuable this is, because you'll never know what you're doing wrong until someone else sees it and says, right, you need to edit this, or you need more detail, or whatever it might be. So definitely make use of it. Okay. Now, we're going to go into what you should do in the actual interview itself, but do we have any questions before I move on? Because I'm aware I'm going at a decent pace. Like I said, if you do, please put your questions in the chat. We'll move on in a second, so if no one has any questions, or if you do, just put them in the chat and I'll get to them at natural pauses in the session, but otherwise, we'll go into what we should be doing during the interview. Okay, so this is basically how to answer those questions that you've prepared for. Right now, there's, like I said, you can predict what they're going to ask, but there are what I'd say maybe describe them as categories of different types of questions that you might be asked. So we've got the motivation, why are you here, basically, or tell me a bit about yourself, or why are you applying for this role. We've got the most common, which is competency. Give me an example of a time you did X. Tell me about a time when you did Y. Strengths-based questions. So what are you good at? What are your particular strengths? Give me an example of something that you excel in. Technical questions, things about software. So give me an example of when you've used CAD. What's your knowledge of, I don't know, Camtasia or Premiere Pro or whatever it might be. And then finally, do you have any questions for us? Now, the important thing to remember with any of these types of questions is you answer them in a similar way, and you have to give an example. You always answer a question through an example. It is never enough to say things like, I've done this all the time, or it's vital to my role. You need to give an example of a time when you've done X or Y. And the more detail in that example, the better. The best way I've found to explain this is you have to give a level of detail in these answers that almost feels a little bit embarrassing, because you will be going over the absolute basics. That doesn't mean you have to talk for minutes upon minutes, but you just have to demonstrate that you understand the basics. So if it's communication, how do you communicate? Okay. Now, the way to do that is using a technique called STAR. Some of you may be aware of this already, but STAR is a simple acronym. You'll see it on the screen. So it's situation, task, action, and result. Okay. And this is the, I guess, breakdown. So how much time you'll be spending on each section. Now, the situation and the task, that's kind of easy, right? So if it's, give me an example of a time when, what were you doing? So what were the circumstances of this example? And what were you trying to achieve? What were you trying to accomplish, the task? That can be a sentence, maybe two. That is your opening. Then you move on to what I would suggest is the most important part, the action. Okay. It's what you did, but, and this is the bit that I find people often forget, how you did it. So not just what you communicated, but how did you communicate, if we stick with that example. And then you finish with the result. What happened as a result of the action you took? Again, as specific as possible. And when you have given that result, that is when you stop talking. It's very common. I see it a lot. People don't know how to finish these examples because you get nervous. You start thinking, did I definitely answer that? Maybe I should give another example. No, you do one complete example and that is it. I've seen quite often where you maybe someone gets nervous. It could happen for a number of reasons, but they'll give multiple sort of averagely developed examples. Always better to have one strong example, give a good result, finish. And I'll show you how this works in a second. I've actually got some examples of students from last year that did this. So I'll show you how it works. But before we do that, I want you to imagine that you're the interviewer, right? And this shows you how it works to an extent, because if you've been, some of you might have been on an interview panel before, but the way it works generally is that you'll ask a specific question and the interviewer will then give each response a score. Now, I've used 0 to 3 here. It might be 0 to 5. It would usually, for us at least, be 0 to 5. But imagine you're the interviewer and you've said, give me an example of a time when you've worked well as part of a team. Now, what I want you to do, as I'm giving these answers, I want you to score them for me. Is it a 0, no evidence, or is it a 3, a detailed account? So this is what they say. I play football twice a week as part of a county team, and we've won 6 out of our 8 matches this season. What are you giving that? Put your answers in the chat for me. Is it a 0, 1, 2, or 3? Okay, mostly saying 1 so far. Any others? One person saying 2. Right. Okay. So it's somewhere between a 0 and a 1. Now, if you think back to STAR, right? So they've given you the situation. They've not given you any action whatsoever. There is no action there. You don't know what they do. You don't know what position they play. You don't know what they do in a match. And you don't know how they do it. I think that's fair as criticism. They've given you a result, but it's not really, there's no connection between those two sentences, right? As far as I could make out, yes, maybe they've won 6 out of 8 matches. They could have been on the bench for the 6 that they won and played in the 2 that they lost and been the reason that they lost. I've no understanding that they know what it is to be part of a team. Now I'm going to add 2 sentences, which immediately I think make this better. So what would you give this? So same opening, play football twice a week, great. During matches, I listen to teammates for instructions and pay attention to and anticipate their next moves. I communicate with the coach about how I could play better and share ideas with the rest of the team. We've won 6 out of 8 matches this season. What are you going to give that? Is that better than a 1? Is it as high as a 3? Put your answers in the chat for me again. So I've got 1, 3, a 2. Okay. Anybody else? 3. All right. So maybe I'm harsh, maybe I'm not. Depends on the panel I'm on. But I would give this again between a 2 and a 3. Okay. So yes, it is better. There is no doubt in that. It would never get above a 3 if it was on a scale of 5, however. The reason is, well, yes, it's giving me what they did and it's giving me a little bit of how they did it. It's not specific enough. This is still I do it all the time. What I would want from this to be really strong, and this is how it would get maybe above a 4 or a 5, sorry, above a 3 towards a 4 or a 5 would be a specific match that they played in. The golden rule of an interview question is the more specific you are, the better. And remember, I said a while ago, you need to give a level of detail that almost sounds embarrassing. There's nothing embarrassing here. There's nothing really detailed. It's still too general. This, like I said, is better, but this is just to show you what we're actually asking for, right? Now, what I'm going to do, these are examples for communication. So again, you guys are going to be the interview panel, right? Now we've got 3 candidates here. What I want you to do is, again, using a scale, and what we're going to do is use 1 to 5 here. So you need to give scores between 1 to 5 for each of these candidates. Now imagine you've asked, give me an example of a time you communicated well as part of a role. What are you going to give them?
Communication is vital to my current role as a volunteer coordinator with Rotary, and I routinely communicate with people across the organization on a daily basis. I am always clear and concise in my communication style and make sure that I am understood by those I am communicating with. Whatever channel I am using, whether it is email, instant message, or face-to-face, I make sure I am respectful and use appropriate language.
Okay, that was Pauline. What score are you giving her? Does she get a 1, 2? Okay, we've got a 2, 2. Okay. Anybody giving her above or anyone giving her below a 2? So most of you saying 2. I think there's safety in numbers. I'll be honest, guys, I'd give that a 1. So what was, if you think, I'll just walk you through my logic, right? What was the concrete example? What was the specific time they communicated well? This was communication is a big part of my role at Rotary. I do it all the time and I am respectful. All right, fine. What are you communicating? How are you communicating? It's not specific enough, right? I would need a specific time that they achieve something through strong communication. So for me, this is probably a 1. Maybe a 2. If I'm being very generous. The thing I would always suggest, though, is don't be generous because you cannot take it for granted. So try and be as ruthless with yourselves as possible. I'm going to show you another one. This is Christy V. What would you give Christy V? Bear with me a sec. That should, yeah. Okay, so this is Christy V. Again, same question, communication. What are you going to give her?
While in my role as a volunteer coordinator for Rotary Manchester, I had to regularly use my communication skills to liaise with volunteers on the front line, as well as with those leading projects. I had to use a variety of different channels such as email, WhatsApp, and direct communication over the phone to coordinate activity for specific projects around fundraising, ensuring that everyone knew their role, where they were supposed to be and when, as well as account for any volunteers who were not available at short notice. Thanks to my excellent communication skills, these projects went very well. We managed to raise record-breaking funds to be shared with different charities that Rotary supports.
Okay, that was Christy V. So I think you'll see better. What are you giving this? What score? Bearing in mind the stuff we've already talked about specifics and, concrete examples. Okay, we've got a 3. Anyone above a 3? We've got 4. All right. Anybody else? 2. Okay. 2. Okay, so you're hovering between a 2 and a 3, maybe a little bit higher. So this is better. It is no doubt that this is better. For me, it doesn't get above a 3. Reason being, yes, they said what they do. They said to a point how they did it, but there's no one concrete example, right? It's in my current role at Rotary, I have to do this all the time. This is how I do it. And it's gone really well. They actually say towards the end, all my projects were successful and we've raised record-breaking funds. But all I can think is, what projects? You've not given me what projects you actually did this with. What records did you break? What funds did you raise? This is what I mean when I talk about the detail. Like I say, you don't have to be talking for loads of time, but you need to be answering these questions. You need to be giving me that detail. And what I'm going to do is show you a 5. and I'm hoping you'll immediately see how much better it is. So this is Riley, and this is exactly the same question, communication, but this is what a 5 would look like.
In my previous role as a volunteer coordinator for Rotary, I organised last year's annual month-long Santa's Sleigh fundraising event. Each year, volunteers raise money for local charities by driving around Santa and his sleigh, collecting money from the local area. My role was to coordinate a team of volunteers for each evening during the week that the sleigh went out. I did this by communicating clearly with the volunteers, making sure that they knew what the expectations on them were in terms of when they had to arrive by, the length of their shifts, and their routes through the estate. I also provided my own personal number to each volunteer so that they were able to contact me quickly if they were unsure of anything. Through this effective communication, I was able to solve last-minute problems that occurred on the night. One specific example being when a volunteer was unable to make it to their shift only half an hour before it was due to start. Having collected everyone's details, I was able to quickly send a message via the WhatsApp group and found a replacement volunteer who was able to get to the estate within half an hour. Thanks in part to my contribution to the team and my coordination of the event, Rotary were able to break our previous record and raise £5,000 across the month, which we were then able to donate to the various charities that we supported. I also received very positive feedback from both the individual volunteers and the Rotary leadership on how I conducted the whole process.
It is. Do you see how that's a 5? All the way through, giving me specifics. There's no questions that I have to ask, because it's this specific project, Santa's Sleigh. This is what we're trying to do, raise as much funds as possible so we could distribute that to other charities. This is what my communication was, setting up a WhatsApp group, making sure that everyone knew what their roles were. And then on the night, there was actually a problem, and this is how my communication solved it. And then finishing with a really strong result, how much they actually raised, the feedback that they got, whether it was positive, how it was positive. This is what a really good example looks like. Okay. Now, yeah, it takes some work and it's going to take some practice. That's why I was saying practice is so important. This doesn't come naturally to most people, but that is what I mean when I say detail. That is what I mean when I say specific, to the point of being almost embarrassing, because you're going over basics. No one thinks about setting up a WhatsApp group because that's just something you do, right? But that's what we need. Another example that I always talk about, when someone was asked that I was interviewing about organizational skills, how they organize themselves, they talked in loads of detail about how they use Google Calendar and how they use that to manage their workload at university. They found that they used to set weekly reminders for all the stuff they had to do that week. Turned out it wasn't working. They weren't on top of their deadlines enough. So on top of those weekly reminders, they set themselves daily tasks to make sure they were hitting those timelines. Because of that, they got a really good score on their dissertation, whatever it was. That is what I mean. It's that level of detail, going over stuff that you would consider basic, because the interviewer isn't going to take it for granted that you understand what those basics are, because they don't know you. This is what we're after. And also, just to point out, I often get asked, how long should I be talking for? How long should an interview answer be? Now, this was a 5. This was loads of detail. This took 1 minute, 45 seconds, roughly. You do not have to be talking for minutes at a time. It's not really the object. What you need to do is answer the question. And as soon as you've done that, you stop. Now, I'm aware I've gone over a lot there, and I've laid into some examples that maybe you thought were, maybe I was being a bit harsh. I don't know. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? And I'll just make sure I move to the next slide. Now, like I said, any questions, put them in and I'll get to them at various pauses. Now, I think, I can't remember who said it, but someone at the start said that one of the things you might be a bit scared about, what if you don't know the answer? It's actually kind of simple. Don't bluff it. Be honest. Just say you don't know. That, I know it sounds weird, but actually that shows a level of confidence that you would be surprised by. Also, don't forget, you're allowed to have your notes. You're allowed to have your aids, whatever it is, that's absolutely fine. If you go in with a notepad and you take notes in the interview, no one is going to bat an eye. That's going to be fine. And this is a small thing, you are allowed to take your time. Don't be afraid to just say to the interviewer, can I just have a second to think about that, please, to pick the best example. Take this at your own pace. Remember, two-way street. If they didn't allow you to take the time, said, no, I want to answer now, would you want to work there? Would that be a pleasant experience? They're probably not going to do that anyway. So don't be afraid to just take your time, take a breath, gather your thoughts. That's absolutely fine. And here are some phrases that you could use. Things like, can I come back to that question? If you genuinely can't think of an example of something exactly what they're asking for, I've not done that before, but this is something similar that I've done, and this example, and use that. Or something like, I've never done that before, but here's how I would tackle it. This is what I would do in that situation. Always better to have a concrete example of the same thing, but if you can't, for whatever reason, you can fall back on these, and that's absolutely fine. But please don't try and bluff it, because that's when things come unstuck. Okay, you won't be able to give that level of detail that we need. And then a few last things to remember. Already said some of these. Not everyone does this, and I'm not saying that you absolutely should, but it can be a good idea to make notes as you're going through the interview. A really simple trick is to make notes about, or maybe write down, the questions that they're asking. Because some questions are in two parts, it can be really easy to answer the first part of the question, forget the second. It can be quite good to have something to refer to gather your thoughts. So making notes during the interview is absolutely fine. Already said the thing about taking time. I guarantee you that any pause that you make while you're speaking, while you're waiting to answer a question, that will sound a lot longer to you than it does to the person listening. So don't be too worried about taking that time. And then think about the fact that you are actually interviewing this company. And like I said, it's a two-way street. So it was always going to be a good idea to have questions for that organization, to have questions at an interview. But think beforehand about what you actually want to ask the company. What are you interested in? What do you need to know to make you think, I do actually want to work for these people? Try and leave things like salary and leave, holidays to later on in the process. That's a conversation to have with HR, but at the actual interview, think about what it is you want to know. One of the questions I always like is, what does success look like in this role? Or what would I have to do in this role within the first 3-6 months maybe to be considered successful? What are you looking for? That can be really helpful. But other things like, how did you end up here? Do you enjoy your job? What's the culture like? All these things that will help you make that decision. And all the way through, I mean, it's a simple thing, right? But talk about the things you're proud of. So when you are doing that preparation, when you are thinking of these examples, are those the examples you really want to shout about? If not, maybe pick another example. Are these the strongest ones? Which, everybody, brings me to the end. So what I will do is just stop the recording